Ohana Book 2 Birds of a Feather Chapter 6. It was a few weeks later that Maddie started noticing something about her boys. That was still so weird to say, but at the same time it rolled off her tongue when she talked to her sister or someone in town asked how they were settling in. She had sons, not one but three. It had taken them months to get though to Sonic that he was their kid, like it or not, and that he was a Wachowski. Tom had taken a moment to cry the afternoon he'd finally called him dead instead of Donut Lord, and in Maddie's opinion it had been a long time coming. She understood it somehow. Being a teenager, an adopted teenager at that, made things a little difficult for Sonic, especially with the fantasy life he'd imagined up for himself in his years of watching the town. She knew tidbits of information about the trauma of his youth, what Tom had indulged her with when they were sitting up one night after the hedgehog had gone to bed, the trauma that he had unloaded on Tom during their cross-country drive to San Francisco. She would never replace Longclaw, call her salty, but she knew it would take him a while to open up and call her mom instead of Maddie or Pretzel Lady. Miles, on the other hand, freely switched between their names and Mom and Dad. The first time had been on accident, when he'd woken up from sleep while they were still up and came out asking for a glass of water. He had called her Mama when handing the glass back to her and seemed almost bashful when he realized what he'd said, before she smiled and told him it was okay if he wanted to call her such. He was so young compared to the other two, it was no wonder it was so easy for him, and Maddie had to ponder just what had happened to his own parents. Knuckles, after their talk on the Kachapum in the morning after his panic attack, she knew he'd been alone his whole life. He had needed to respond to authority figures, and while he had yet to adjust his formal tone around them, he still insisted on calling her Lady Pretzel and Tom Lord Donut. He took care of Sonic and Miles while they were at work, or Wade was too busy to. Despite the former's insistence he could take care of himself, and he clearly cared for them as brothers, yet she wondered if the familiarity had made itself known to him.
He'll come around eventually.
Tom said that night when she brought it up, arm wrapped around her and flicking the channel to the movie station. The boys were in bed and it was time for some quality alone time with each other, something that they didn't get very often these days.
He's a bit older than Sonic, right? I know if I was his age and my mom were married or something, I'd be hesitant to.
Well, his butt.
Maddie worried her bottom lip, fingers finding Ozzy's hair and scratching him behind the ear.
I don't know. Do you find it weird that Sonic calls you Dad but not me Mom?
Tom tilted his head to look at her before leaning down to press his lips to her forehead.
That's not with all beds. He's only been living with us for a year in time. Things tend to go with the kids anyway.
She pouted, leaning into the affection.
You just don't want me to steal your thunder.
Maybe.
Tom chuckled as she bopped his nose, wrinkling it and pulling back to give her a look.
Besides which, I don't know if you've noticed, but Knuckles practically fawns over you.
What?
Remember, he wanted beans in his dreads like yours. I don't think I've seen him sit so long enough for anyone to touch him, let alone play with his clothes. Not to mention the coffee machine incident.
Maddie pursed her lips together, remembering the air burn on the back of her hand. Knuckles didn't stop glaring at the coffee maker for a week.
I don't think that's fawning. I think he's just getting interested in our things. The other day he asked me if he could tend to the garden.
Tom tutted his tongue against the roof of his mouth and turned his attention back to the TV, resting his free arm along the back of the couch.
I think the difference is Sonic had a mom, Knuckles had a dad. From what he told me, it could take them a long time to call us a trauma expert.
Clearly not.
She teased.
But it could be guilt stopping them from moving on from them.
Maddie nestled herself back in the crook of his arm, dropping her head closer to his collarbone as he chose what they were going to watch. Tom's steady heartbeat reached her ear, and it was almost like old times. He was right, she supposed. She could only give them time, but at the same time she was kind of jealous. Then again, Sonic had always been closer to Tom than her. Halfway into the movie there was a rustling off to the side and she lifted her head to see bright purple eyes in the dark of the room. Tom was fast asleep, snoring on her shoulder, and Maddie saw Knuckles flinch at himself before he slunk into the light of the tent. She nudged Tom, making him snort and wake up, grumbling before he saw who was there, and he ran his hand through his hair, giving Knuckles a tired smile.
Can't sleep, Hinu.
The Echidna fidgeted with his hands, bare of gloves, and Maddie nudged Tom again for his casual use of the term. The sheriff winced at the sharpness of his wife's elbow, and he shifted to make room between them.
We're watching only if you want to join us.
I would like that, Lord of Donuts.
Knuckles looked at Maddie, who gave him a small smile, and encouragingly patted the space between them. He shifted forward, and fit between them somewhat differently to Sonic. While Sonic had grown over the last year with them, there was no denying that Knuckles was all muscle and little fat, though he was starting to soften a bit. Maddie attributed that to her cooking. He sat stiffly in the middle and his shoulders were sunken as though ashamed of himself for seeking their comfort.
What are you watching?
Just an old spaghetti western called A Fistful of Dollars.
Knuckles looked at the barely their color and grunted.
I do not see this spaghetti you are referring to, Donut Lord.
It just means it's an Italian western.
What are Italians?
You know Mario and Luigi,
The small men who drive carts. I am familiar.
Italian loosely.
Knuckles just looked more confused than ever, but Tom dropped the subject and just let the Echidna become fixated on the movie. It must have worked with whatever nerves had woken him up, because Maddie saw him visibly relax, his eyes darting from one side of the screen to another as Tom caught him up on who was the good guy and who was the bad. He seemed interested, his tail tipping and flexing with every exciting moment and everyone that was supposed to be distressing, and she made a mental note on how he was accepting the dialogue.
And this Clint of Eastwood. How is your man with no name when his name is right there?
It's just the character he plays, Knuckles.
And here's a way that he has a name.
Yes, Knuckles.
Is it?
Very frequently.
Maddie hid the smile on her face behind her hand, watching him lean slightly into her husband as the film started to reach the climax. Knuckles felt white as the movie ended, reaching to rub an eye with the heel of his palm.
I do not think I would like to be without a name again.
He whispered, yawning as the humans looked over him at each other with alarm.
What do you mean again?
Maddie asked softly, reaching to brush her fingers against the closest dreadlock. Knuckles made a murmur, his muscles less tense than they had been.
Knuckles is my clan name. I carry it as a reminder.
He leaned into her touch, nestling his head into her shoulder. Tom looked at her with worry on his face. Just what had their eldest kid been through? The line between being left by his tribe and when he started working with Robotnik was still a mystery.
Okay, time for bed.
Maddie reached around him and drew him closer to her, feeling him nuzzle in and gathered him from the couch, sending.
You want to come to our bed or back to yours, honey?
I can walk.
He grumbled, but didn't protest as she started carrying him downstairs to his basement bedroom. Tom shut the door behind them, getting up to get ready for his own sleep, and Ozzy padded after him. Maddie watched herself as she descended with an armful of Echidna, the warrior nearly asleep in her arms by the time she settled him into bed and pulled the covers over him. She kissed his forehead and turned away to sneak back upstairs before she heard a faint noise.
Thank you, Mother.
Maddie stopped and turned to look at him, smiling softly.
Good night, Knuckles.
Elsewhere in Green Hills, a driver slammed their brakes on before their car collided with a large hammer.